All right, welcome everybody to the HPC Best Practices webinar for May. We're very happy today to have Richard Acton with us from the Babraham Institute in the UK, and it's a little late for him, so we especially appreciate his flexibility about the timing. He's going to share with us some checklists he's developed to help ensure that your software is ready to be shared. As always with these webinars, we want to interact with you. And so we have a Google Doc where we gather questions and I can moderate putting them to Richard as we go along and at the end. And there's a link there, which I'll put in the chat so everybody can access that. We'd also very much appreciate your feedback. There's a short survey about the webinar. And also the opportunity to suggest other topics or speakers if you're interested, and I'll also be putting that in the chat. And then, as always, we're recording this session, and we'll make this the recording together with the slides and the Q&A notes available. You can go back and look at it. You can share it with others who weren't able to make it. Everybody who's registered for this session will get an email announcement when those are out. When the archives are up. Otherwise, you can go to the webpage and check there. So with that, I will turn it over to Richard.
Thank you very much, David. Can everyone see my screen? Looks like it.
Yep.
Good. Okay. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on your time zone, everyone. As David said, I'm Richard. Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. So the project I'm going to talk to you about today, this research software sharing, publication, and distribution checklists, is a bit of a side project that got out of hand. I was originally writing it for the members of my research consortium, the Human Developmental Biology Initiative, but I thought I could produce a more useful general resource. If you'd like to follow along with today's slides, there's a URL there and a QR code, and the website rsspdc.org has a link to the slides if you want to pull them up there. So outline for today's talk, I'm going to start with the role of software in research and defining a few terms. Then I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies of examples of where errors in research relevant software have caused problems, just for some anecdote value to make it feel a bit more real, and then a more bigger quantitative picture of the state of computational reproducibility in the literature, and then a little bit about what we can do about it and the role that I hope that the checklist project can play there, and then some examples of items from the checklist to give you a bit of a flavor for what using this is actually like. Bit of a disclaimer, this project is still in what I would consider kind of an alpha phase. It's not entirely feature complete. There's a few bits missing from a couple of the checklists, and I'm looking for people with the relevant expertise to come along and help fill in some of the gaps in mine. So if anyone wants to get involved, there's an open to contributions as an open source project. So, as you undoubtedly are aware, software in research is now ubiquitous and integral to basically every research project, and in many different ways. It's in embedded software and instrumentation, it's in statistical analysis and visualization, it's in modeling and simulation. Wherever you go in research, you can't avoid it. And important decisions by policymakers are made based on the outputs of software that is used in research. So it matters a lot that this is correct, but at the same time, we're in a position where it's oftentimes relatively inexperienced people writing some of this code. It's not entirely their main focus, and it can't be in many ways. It's can't have all of the expertise in one person. So there's lots of challenges associated with this area. Yes, the other thing that is interesting about research software is you've got a bunch of different sort of types of it. You've got your one-off scripts, and then you've got stuff which people are actually intending to reuse, and they play slightly different functions. There's slightly different importance associated with them. So the one-off scripts, however, are an important component of the methods of most people's work. There's a quote that I particularly like from John Claerbout that was codified by Buckhite and Donahoe in their paper recounting some of the practices from John's lab. And it goes, an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself. It is merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete software development environment and the complete set of instructions which generated the figures. So it takes a broad view of what constitutes the methods of this. A little bit of on the more theoretical side, when we're thinking about what we want from research software, we don't just narrowly want reproducibility, as in the ability to get the same result from the same inputs. We also want something that's a bit more expansive in definition. We want verifiability, which is that we want to be able to understand what the code is doing and make sure that is a correct instantiation of whatever the scientific model is that we're attempting to represent with it. So this requires, in many ways, access to the underlying source code, not just narrowly the ability to repeat it. So there are some limitations to what you can achieve from the perspective of computational verifiability with merely being able to reproduce a result where you might have done it with an artifact which is itself not terribly inspectable. So if you've created a container image or a virtual machine image, but you can't reproduce that image, you might not necessarily have enough information to debug some of the more subtle causes of error or subtle causes of a misunderstanding that can arise. And this is a very complex problem in the modern software stack, and existing tooling is not great for it. There's a relatively small number of things that can really address that problem, things like NICs and geeks. So related to the question of verifiability is artificial intelligence. And well, large language models, as they're increasingly being used in development of research code and code all over the place. So this quote is from an internal IBM training manual, has been circulating of late, and it goes, a computer can never be held accountable, therefore a computer must never make a management decision. And I think the same thing applies in the context of authoring scientific work, because one of the functions of authorship in research is accountability. So a computer cannot be held accountable for the contents of a scientific paper, so it cannot be listed as an author on one. You can disclose, and one should disclose, the use of artificial intelligence in the production of a scientific work, but not name them as an author is my view on the subject. And it's up to you to understand well enough any outputs generated by these systems so that you can vouch for its correctness. And that I'm not going to delve into how we can address the problems that many more people having access to the capacity to generate code that they may not understand the ins and outs of will have, but it's difficult to discuss this topic without at least mentioning it. So I will move on from that now. This is another framing for the ability to reproduce computation. It's inspired by the 4 freedoms from software freedom. You have the inspectability, so the ability to actually inspect all of the input data and the source code to understand what it is, the ability to run that code on a suitable computer to verify those outputs. Importantly, the explorability section that's actually understand and manipulates all of the intermediate steps and code so that you can test different hypotheses for what might be sources of error. And confirmability, which is, as I'm defining it here, the ability to get the exact same version and verify that any binaries are in fact produced from the source code. Now, the more conventional definition of reproducibility here is effectively, in a narrow sense, the ability to take the same code and the same data and get the same output. And this is the first step or the sort of foundation on which you build some of the more, in many ways, important scientific support for your conclusion. You want your results to be replicable, the ability to produce the same general conclusion using a different data set and the same analysis, the ability of a different analysis to be robust to the different analytical decisions that you made in the first one, so using the same data and getting a different analysis, and lastly, making code that is generalizable, the ability to take a completely independent data set, completely independent code set, and get to the same result. Most of the focus of this is on the narrow question of reproducibility. It's in many ways the easiest to address, but still surprisingly difficult. So here's the section of a couple of informative examples, randomly plucked from my reading in the literature of case studies of this kind of thing. So in this example, someone discovered a small glitch in a set of scripts known as the Willoughby-Hoy scripts that were used for calculating NMR chemical shifts. It just so happened this is a platform-dependent bug. So at the time, Python, when you ran it on a Windows machine or a Unix machine, did different things with the order of the files that it got when you asked it to list files from a directory. And this script was expecting files to be read in pairs. So, the two files read at the same time would correspond to two different data sets about the same molecule or set of molecules, analytical sample. And it turned out that was not the case. When you ran these on I think it was a Unix platform, it worked fine on the Windows platform. So you effectively had a randomized order of those files. So you got a incorrect result out the other end. And no one really noticed this for quite some time. The scripts were published in 2014, but the Nature Protocols paper was cited over 130 times before the fix to the issue was published in 2019. So minor little thing, and yet potential to impact a variety of publications. This was an interesting example where a couple of people spotted some minor inconsistencies in visualizations in a paper and thought, I better dig in a little bit more and see if I can figure out why some of this data looks like it's duplicated. And it turned out that in this particular study, people were attempting to use gene expression information in cell lines they'd grown in culture to predict the response of people to different cancer drugs. So they were using that data to attempt to assign people to different arms of a clinical trial. But it turned out that they had various errors in this process. They had duplicated some data. They had swapped the labels on some data. They had an off by one error that meant that the list of gene names was off by one with respect to the actual genes that were being labeled in their figures. So, some relatively consequential errors, and yet, this data was used to assign people to different arms of a clinical trial. A few other sort of quick fire examples. 5 papers were retracted after a bug in a script for processing protein structures flipped 2 columns around. There was a paper retracted after the treatment and control groups were swapped in a trial for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I suppose, fortunately, as it turned out, there was another bug in this same paper that found out that the imputation method that they were using for missing values was incorrect. So it turned out the result was not significant, and there wasn't any particular difference between the treatment group and control group. If there had been a real difference, then they would have been advising people against the intervention that would have been producing the more favorable result. So fortunate, I suppose. There was a highly politically influential paper in economics that accidentally missed out, I think it was 5 whole countries from their analysis, and that completely changed the effect that they were projecting, and that was relatively influential in various policymakers' decision-making. So one pattern that does tend to come up when you notice when you read these sort of anecdotal accounts in the literature, is that when a single error is discovered and people are suddenly motivated to scrutinize a result a bit more closely, more tend to be found, which is suggestive that if we happened to scrutinize our work a little bit more closely, we'd probably find more errors than we might like. So now a quick overview of some slightly bigger picture things. Some good news. Code and data sharing policies are increasing. So the number of journals that require people to deposit their code and data has been going up quite significantly in the last 30 odd years. The number of journals that require a reproducibility check is still pretty low, but is creeping up. So journals that actually will not accept the paper unless they can reproduce some of your results. A few of them exist, but still very much in the minority. Another element there is that compliance with these policies is not always perfect. So whilst the policies are on the uptick, the availability of data and code is also on the uptick. But you might notice that even when ostensibly journal policy for deposition is mandatory in the purple there, you're only a little over 40% deposition in some cases. Might be some cases where these are non-data articles, but the compliance is not always very well enforced. So some perhaps unsurprising results, but nonetheless nice to have some empirical numbers to back up what you might intuit, is that, well, firstly, having data and code is much better than just having data. And having data cleaning code makes a very big difference to the ability to reproduce a result. This is from one of the nice big replication studies that was in Nature just a few weeks ago. And this one is particularly focused on computational reproducibility. And another thing to note from the results of this is that code very much increases the fraction of results that you're able to reproduce more precisely. So whilst you might be able to get in the same ballpark, same rough direction, in the absence of code and just data, if you want more numerical precision in your ability to reproduce, providing the code definitely helps, which makes a lot of sense. The many decisions about analytical techniques are not necessarily always rendered perfectly clear in methods sections, so the ambiguity inherent in talking about that in English rather than in code produces uncertainty in the description of the experiment. So this is some numbers from a slightly different approach to assessing this. This was a single study which reported multiple different results, and then those results were attempted to be computationally reproduced by roughly 40 teams in each of these two groups. So there was a group that had a transparent access to the code, the data, the paper, and an opaque group that had access to effectively just the data and the methods description, not even the numerical results, so sort of a worst case scenario. And in this case, this was a reasonably high rate of most of the teams being able to produce at least directionally correct numerical results from the description that they were given, even in the opaque condition. But exact replicability was still much lower in the case of not having access to all of the information. And one thing that is worth noting, one of the big differences was that the transparency made the reproduction much more accessible to sort of a variety of different analysts. So the ability of most of the teams to get an exact replication was much higher than the ability of most of the teams to get a partial replication when you had the additional data. So it makes a big difference to the ability of a variety of different analysts to be able to get the same result. So if you want it to be easier, then having the code available is very important. But code and data isn't the end of the story. Even when you have code and data available, there's still drop-off. this figure on the bottom left here is quite a nice little visualization, I think, about the sources of sort of loss to various forms of error. The sort of overall rate of reproduction from the starting papers in this study found that it's sort of about 1%. It's not very many. But when you get to the stage where data, code, and documentation are available, you're still only getting about 20% of reproduction. So even when we're doing ostensibly the right thing and providing the code and data, the actual rates of reproduction are still not necessarily particularly high. There's an indication that there is a significant sort of gap in documentation, because when the number of potentially reproducible results was quantified, the ones that had the relevant information available, was based on what was just in the literature, was pretty low here. But once you go back to the original authors and ask them for additional details, the number of potentially reproducible results goes up quite a lot. So the overall reproducibility rate might go from something in the few percentage point marks to as high as a quarter if authors actually include all the information in their publications that they do when they're actually asked for additional details. So I think there's room there for uplift in practice, as it were. Plenty of additional details that just minor stuff that authors can be encouraged to include, and it makes a big difference to the ability to reproduce the work. There was an observation in one of these papers as well that noted that it seemed that specificity in journal policy really mattered. There's a lot of ambiguity in journal policy. A couple of studies have looked at this. A lot of journal policy that is internally contradictory about whether or not deposition is mandatory or merely recommended, and very little detail about what constitutes data deposition, what constitutes code deposition, what is meant by data, raw data, secondary data. Authors are kind of often left to their own devices when it comes to what it is that they should deposit. Oops. So, quick recap: why reproducibility matters. Focus on the underlying sort of analytical sources of variation and not technical ones. If we can narrowly reproduce it, we can do that. We want transparency of the process so that we can show people how we came to our conclusions. We can find incorrect errors with important implications for consequential decisions if we can see what's going on. And also the question of, if we describe our compute environments well, we don't lose time to dependency hell and the whole "it worked on my machine" problem, make it portable. So what can we do about all this? Well, the sort of question that I came into this with was, what actually are the best practices that are out there? How are they codified for treating software as kind of a research output? And of course, the secondary question of how can we get those adopted? I was sort of inspired by the community of image analysis and image data deposition people who have this very effective group called Quarep-Limi, bit of a long name, but very effective in that they've managed to get some of their policies adopted by major journals, added to the deposition checklists for microscopy data. And I thought I'd like to try and emulate some of what they do. I did some searching for the existing resources that were out there in kind of a simple checklist form that followed the same approach that Quarep had followed in their community developed checklists plan. Just was there a checklist? There are a few that exist. There's a sort of decision tree for software management planning and an accompanying guide. There's the FAIR software self-assessment checklist, little web form that runs you through sort of the FAIR principles, the findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, as they apply to software. But these felt a little bit lacking to me in a couple of ways. They were initially sort of too focused on a particular type of research software output. Some of them have a little bit of granularity in this regard, but a lot of them are biased towards, especially the software management planning resources, individual library type pieces of software, application level pieces of software where you have people who are research software developers, sort of that's their main focus. They're writing code for other people to reuse. There wasn't really enough stuff, I think, providing advice on what you might call one-off analyses or research compendia stuff, which is, how do I do the statistical analysis or the data visualization for this one paper? A lot of these checklists and documents were kind of sat there on a server somewhere or in a journal somewhere as a long PDF, and unless you have the very particular intersection of interests that I have that makes you go looking for PDFs about software policy, you're not that likely to stumble across them. And if you do, they're probably a bit of a slog to get through, and not necessarily going to be something you can incorporate into your workflow as you're going day to day. As I similarly with a checklist that you kind of apply at the end of a project, if you go to a web page and fill out a form, it's something that you're doing linearly, probably towards the end of the project. And I wanted something that was a different form to this that could kind of fit into existing workflows, that you could do asynchronously. You wouldn't have to do it all in a particular order. So the approach that I've taken is to design these sets of research software checklists that take the form of a simple markdown file that you can add to your code repository in the same way that you might add a license file or a code of conduct file, and then tick off the markdown checkboxes as you go. I also have them in the form of GitHub and GitLab issue templates in case you don't want them actually in your code base. That's a new addition. But the bigger picture of these is that I've split them up into 4 broad types. You've got your checklists that apply to generic unitary tools, software packages, the sort of the thing that there is often relatively good advice for already in software management planning. But also multi-part workflows and pipelines. These are pretty common in the world of bioinformatics and image analysis. You have a whole bunch of different tools strung together, and they're designed to be deployed across a big HPC cluster. There are some pretty good resources out there for packaging them up as things that you can distribute to be deployed on different HPC clusters, but they have some slightly different considerations. You've got web-based services, applications, databases, APIs, stuff that people are going to remotely access. Important considerations there for how to make that reproducible. Things like keeping track of versions, both of the tooling in the database and random seeds. And then you've got the record of a specific analysis or research compendium, the one-off set of scripts. I haven't yet written a checklist for this, but I'm quite interested in trying to put one together that has a specialism for embedded software, software that runs on scientific instruments. But yeah, that's a to be done at some point, hopefully, currently. So I've broken up each of those classes of software into these 11 sections that I think are common between all of them, but which require slightly different advice for each of them. So you've got source control, how do you keep track of the history of your project and how do you collaborate on it? You've got licensing, on what terms can others use your code and how can you communicate this to them? Documentation, how do people know what your project is, how to use it, how to contribute to it? Making it citable, how do people reference your project and give you credit for your work? Testing, how do you test your project so that people can be, so that you can be confident, and other people, I suppose, also, that it does what you think it does. Automation, what tasks can you automate, things like CI and CD, to reduce the amount of manual work that you do, linting, all kinds of stuff like that. Peer review and code review, how can you get third-party endorsement or expert feedback on your project to get it some additional credibility and improve its quality? How do you distribute the work so that other people can install it? How do you do environment management and portability? How do people get specific versions of the software that you're running on your system, on their system? There's some overlap between those two. Energy efficiency, particularly relevant in the HPC context. How do we not waste energy if we don't have to when we're running our code? Also make it run quicker. And lastly, but by no means least, governance, conduct, and continuity. It's how do you be excellent to one another, make good decisions well, and continue to do so in the future? And that has slightly different emphases depending on which type of software project you're running. But everything from continuity planning to who will pick up the repository, who has access to the secrets, who can actually commit to things, versus and who's making decisions, who's enforcing the code of conduct, all kinds of questions that can be under that umbrella. And lastly, the other thing that I found a little bit lacking from some of the other checklists was I found them a little bit not really very aspirational. There was a lot of, clear this minimum bar, but then there's a bunch of interesting things that you can and might want to do that go a bit above and beyond the base level of reproducibility and managing the project. So what additional things could I add to suggest people do? And the idea here is that bronze should be highly attainable and platinum is very difficult. You might have to invent some new things to get platinum. It's a steep difficulty curve. And I've attempted a little bit to kind of, I don't know, maybe nerd snipe some people into gamifying this, trying to get some points to put on their little badges. There's a repository badge that you can put a medal and a point on, and different ones for each of those components. As a scoring system, this looks a little bit complicated, but the point of this slide is primarily to note that in order to get the bronze medal, you have to get at least bronze level in all of the categories. And above that, it's just 1 point for bronze, 4 points for platinum. Add up them all, divide by 11, the number of categories, and then round down, and that will be between 1 and 4. So that'll give you your medal level, unless you have anything that's not at the bronze level. So you have to get at least 1 in everything, then you get bronze, and above that, it's basically just the average of your point score for the overall project medal. And I've got slightly different versions of each of these badges. The other one I have here is a variant for if you have a third party attest, as it were, to the score. Someone external to you has provided a score using the checklists, so it lends a little extra credibility. And as I alluded to, the workflow for making use of this is that you put this markdown file in your repository. And then as you make changes to your project, you might put them in the same commit or the same group of commits. The update to the project, that means that you've implemented one of the changes in the checklist, and the checking off that item in the checklist. That way you can look through your Git history and see what the checklist changed and what things you changed in the project to meet those criteria. And of course, if you're not using the checklist in your repository, you've got the issue tracking history in your ticket manager on whatever your Git Forge platform of choice is. So I'll just do a quick overview of the website. This is the website that the checklists are available from. There's a bit of a blurb on the front page. I've got an FAQ page with answering a few questions. There's a badge generator. I should probably re-implement that in JavaScript. It'll be a little bit faster to load. I'll come back to that. You've got a copy of each of the checklists. Each of the checklists has the sort of criteria that you tick off in order to tick off the checklist item, and they're accompanied by some sort of tips and tricks and additional information and resources in these expandable sections associated with each of those, so that you know what it is that you need to do in order to check those boxes off. They're also available in sort of light form that leaves out the ticks. So if you want to, if you're a minimalist and you want the minimal size in your repository and you don't want all the tips and tricks included, you just want to be able to tick items off, you can drop those. And then there's links to the raw versions of these just there. The media page has some resources from previous times I've talked about this. There's a link to all the different slide decks for the talks I've given about this. There's a copy of or a link to my Zotero library that has a couple of hundred papers in there from all the reading on computational reproducibility related questions. So if you want to follow up on any of the references in this talk, you'll find everything on the website. Oh yes, and there's a GitLab repository. It's mirrored over on GitHub if that's easier for you, but primarily issue tracking and so on happens on GitLab, and it's in the checklist project. So the examples that I'm going to go over of some items from the checklist come from the record of a specific analysis or research compendium checklist. This is just a description at the top of the checklist so that it can inform people which checklist they should pick for their project. Source control, this is sort of a summarized version in bullet point form of the contents of the tips section. You've got the Git history is in many ways the laboratory notebook for a computational project. If you're a bench scientist, then you keep a sort of chronological record of everything that you did in the lab. But there isn't really a good training for translating that same record-keeping practice to computational projects, at least not in my experience of training in this area. I think that's something we really need to try and get more into the training, is teaching people version control early on, because it serves the function of providing that change over time record. And then this sort of outlines some of the more advanced scenarios. So the advice for platinum stuff that you could be doing is things like cryptographically signing and timestamping your commits. For improved provenance, there are some regulated contexts where having a laboratory notebook with that kind of cryptographic timestamping is relevant, and Git has all of that covered for you. These are the checklist criteria that I currently have for Git in this context, which is very easy at the bronze level, which is just that you're using some kind of version control. It might have a very shallow project history. Maybe you just uploaded it to GitHub in order to share the code. The silver is that you've got a slightly longer project history. Maybe your commit messages are of mixed quality. You've got some slightly big messy changes that should probably have been a few more separate commits, but and then in the gold tier, you've got well-written commit messages, nice granular changes, discrete, self-contained. Maybe you've got tagged releases. You've got a strategy for branching. A few more of the Git best practices, and then in the sort of more overkill version of things, the platinum mode, which may or may not be overkill for some applications, but you're following something like conventional commits. You've got a nice clean history. You've got a strategy for how you're going to organize your branching and merging. Maybe you sign your commits. That sort of approach. Licensing, academics quite frequently forget to put licenses on their code repositories, and it's very important that it's there, because if you don't have a license, then because of the status quo of copyright law, you retain all rights to it, and anyone reusing it is potentially in violation of your copyright. So they expose themselves out to some liability that their institutions would rather they not expose themselves to. Those licenses should be open. I maintain that proprietary code in science is not really science; it's alchemy, because you can't show me what it is that you're doing. If you won't show me how you did it, that is the difference between alchemy and science. If you haven't provided me with the means of reproducing it, then we all independently have to discover that drinking mercury is a bad idea, and no one wants to do that. So there's a couple of minor exceptions in a couple of forms of source available, might be sciencier and less alchemical in nature than closed source. But if it's closed, it has no place in the scientific process, in my view. There may be limits for other reasons, national security applications and so on, but in that case, it is only sciencier with respect to the people you're allowed to share it with, but no one outside the bubble of people you're allowed to share it with have a particularly robust reason for believing that it does what you says it does. So that's the licensing criteria. The bronze is pretty easy. Just have a license file that meets one of the open source definitions by some of the people who are considered authorities on this, such as the open source institutes, Debian and the FSF. If it meets one of those organizations' criteria for being an open license, then it fits. Content that isn't software should probably be licensed under a Creative Commons license, especially if it's documentation and not covered by a component of the license. Some software licenses don't include the documentation in their description of things. So depending on which one you've picked, you might need to separately provide licensing of other content in your repository. So if you have a complex multi-license project, you might want to be using something like the reuse.software tooling to ensure that you have indications for each of the different licenses that apply to different components of your project. For the gold tier, looks like for the platinum one, I might have been running out of ideas. Yes, for image data, how should you embed that information? There's not a good standard around this for image metadata. I want someone to improve the standardization for accessing licensing information embedded in images. So I think I put that one there in the platinum tier. Documentation, very important one. How do people know what your project is and how to contribute to it? Critically important that it's clear, that it describe how your project is structured, how to install your project, the environment, its dependencies, where the files in the project are to be found for particular functions, how to install it, how to run it, what form the inputs and outputs are expected, what commands you may need to run with what flags, details about how to modify the project. So if you need to make an alteration to it, where should you go? Details of not just what's there, but why, sort of motivation, what is it that the project is for, what does it do, how does it do it? Also details of things like how to contribute back to the project, what level of support to expect from its developers, if any. Lots of things to be included in the documentation. This is, I think, the longest current item in the checklist, so quite a few criteria there. And relatively high bar for the bronze tier for the documentation, just because I think documentation is really one of the more important aspects to have right from the beginning. And in the context of academic articles that this checklist is applying to, the sort of the platinum tier is the full end-to-end computational pipeline that takes in all the data, gets it from its appropriate sources, does all the processing, generates the statistics and the figures, formats those all into a literate programming artifact, and that's the article that you have at the end. Everything is fully contained and fully rerunnable. That's the sort of the gold standard. Making things citable. There's a big push in research software engineering to get more people credit for research software as an output of academic research. Over in the UK, we have the Research Excellence Framework, which is our assessment of academic institutions. And there's a work in the sort of campaigning in that policy area and has quite successfully, I think, in what the criteria now are for assessing research. That will include so-called non-traditionally submitted outputs, things like research software in the assessment of research institutions. So the ability to submit software as a research output is aided along by making it follow some of the conventions of academic papers. So making it citable so that people can point to a piece of software using all of the existing tooling that is used for citing academic sources is very helpful. There's a nice standard for this in the citation.cff file. There's also code meta as another JSON formatted file that you can add to your code repositories to make them readable by citation managers and by software repositories. So things like Zenodo for generating DOIs or software heritage for archiving them and getting yourself a persistent identifier for your code. Actually, that's the other point that I wanted to make here is that GitHub has been rising precipitously in terms of the number of times it is mentioned in academic papers, so much more so in archive. It makes sense. It's a bit more physical sciencey, but still pretty big and very much growing in the PubMed central corpus of documents. We're up at something like 3% of medical papers with a GitHub link in them somewhere. And GitHub links are not persistent identifiers, right? A GitHub repository can change. It can be deleted. It can change hands. The build artifacts or the zip tarzip files can be modified and no longer point to the same thing. So for academic referencing, we really want to be using persistent identifiers like software heritage identifiers or a Zenodo DOI. Software heritage is very nice in that it captures the entire project. It archives the Git history of the project, not just a snapshot in time like Zenodo, which is just one point. So depending on whether or not you have a rich Git history that's worth archiving, it may be worth using the software heritage archive to ensure that your code is still available and people can still point to it.
If you need to get, well, I do have one question. Are they going to do this?
Was that question addressed to me, or was that an accidental unmuting? Okay, I'm going to carry on. Yes, so these are the checkbox items for this. I think I might actually need to invert the first two. I think it may be more important to have the software heritage identifier or Zenodo, a persistent identifier, applied than to have a citation.cf file, to have the metadata available for citation managers. It's a little easier to do the former than it is the latter. But I've had some feedback that people think that this might be better to do the other way around. The other sort of value adds here are at the gold tier is making sure that you're using something to represent the different kinds of contribution that people have made to the software project. When people deposit software associated with a paper, it's pretty common for them to just sort of copy paste the author list over from the paper rather than necessarily provide different attribution to the software itself. And it's useful for people who are trying to specialize in a research technical professional career to have the software attributable to them, as in you're the primary developer of this code, but maybe you're not the first author on the paper. So it's still having your credit as it's due for the software development work or the analysis code work is relevant in how you construct the citation metadata. Also, the ability to identify individuals in a persistent manner, so using ORCIDs instead of just names, and indeed using RORs for identifying institutions, the equivalent of an ORCID for an institution. Yes. And then some improved citation stuff that you can do to both better represent any external stuff that you're citing and better represent your dependencies. So peer review and code review. For the bronze, this can be just a simple check. Someone other than you can run your code on a different system to yours, ideally, and without your intervention, that your documentation and so on to be in a state where someone else can run your work. And then the sort of next tier that you can go to with this is having an external organization or accreditation body check that your code is rerunnable by them. Code check is one such organization. You can give your code to them and ask them can they rerun it and get the same results. That's all they check. They don't do a more detailed review of it. They just check if it's reproducible. ReproHack is a similar project, although it's kind of organized in a hackathon form rather than necessarily an ongoing thing. But they're a group that you can submit work to and see if they can reproduce it. And beyond that, you might want to submit work to someone that does code peer review. In the context of the record of a specific analysis, this doesn't apply, but in for software packages, there are there's ROpenSci for R packages, there's PyOpenSci for Py packages. They do a full academic paper style peer review on your code and check it for code quality, or you might submit it to a journal like the Journal of Open Source Software, where you include a small blurb about the software, but you have a peer review of the tool, all managed on GitHub. So there are code review opportunities out there that can go above and beyond just checking other people can reanalyze it. Environment management and portability. Actually defining your software dependencies, making sure that it's in a format that allows them to be easily installed with some of the automated tooling. You might use something like containers or Conda or Nix that lets you, represent that. Eliminating your hard-coded paths. It's amazing how common this is in research code on GitHub. People have an absolute path on their system that points to a folder that does not exist in the project. So making sure everything is just relative to the project root. Yes, so this is the sort of base tier of that is just providing the simple sort of human readable description of what the versions are of the software in the environment that you ran. The step above that is providing a more structured representation of this. So having a lock file of some kind, depending on your language, they have different names, but a tool that will represent all of your language specific dependencies. Beyond that, a more complete description that lets you handle system level dependencies outside of your language. So a lock file in R will not handle the fact that you need, libxml2 in order to parse XML, and that may be at an incorrect version in your system package manager. So you need something that can handle system level package dependencies to really give you a complete picture and capture that, be that in a container or with a functional package manager. And then lastly, using the functional package managers like Nix and Geeks and stuff, which has bitwise binary reproducibility. Debian just the other day has announced that in Debian 14, all of their packages will be required to be reproducible from source. So that's a good step in the direction of binary reproducibility. But beyond that, even potentially the ability to bootstrap your entire dependency tree. So compile everything from source in the right order, starting from a single minimal handwritten binary, which in an automated fashion can be done by the Geeks package manager and for a subset of the Nix packages. I think lastly, of the ones I've highlighted here is governance, conduct, and continuity. I covered most of this in my brief summary, to be honest. I think it's just that, the sorts of questions asked depend a bit on the project, but it can be as simple in the context of an academic lab of, who runs the GitHub org? Is it the postdoc who's left? Because now no one can change your permissions. So, make sure that your lab PI or someone else senior in the group knows how to run the GitHub org, preferably has their two-factor enabled, and can assign people new roles as they join the lab. Have you got some conduct rules spelled out there? What are the expected workflows? What are your standard operating procedures for using the system you have set up? Most importantly, just clearly communicate whatever your governance model is. It can be, it's just me, I'm the benevolent dictator for life until something better comes along, but people should know that in advance. Beyond that, like, do you have some kind of continuity planning? Have you archived it? Is it mirrored to another platform? Who can take over in the event that you're no longer running the project? This adjusts to the scale of the project, but at some point, do you have terms of reference and who's on what committee? How's that documented? Where's it stored? All the usual stuff that you have of governing an organization. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Those were the examples. This is another link to the presentation slide. Thanks to my supervisor, who's allowed me to spend time on this, what was originally a side project, and grew a little bit. And to my funder, welcome. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a very excellent, thorough presentation.
Thank you.
We have had a few questions come in. We are close to the top of the hour, but if you have time, we'll spend a few minutes extra to try to answer them in the recording, and people can leave as they need to.
I have time. Sorry, I ran a bit long.
No worries. It happens. So first of all, regarding versioning, if a project started, commit messages might be of lesser quality, how should one improve the quality to reach the gold level, or will old bad commits, in quotes, prevent improved quality assessment?
There's inherently going to be a bit of that with projects that start out with a relatively loose approach to their commit messages. You can't really rewriting the history is a lot of work, and it's probably not worth it. So I think the gold tier is taking that into account, as it were. Like most projects, if you go back, even big ones, and look at their early commit history, it's not always the cleanest. So I know an early history that's a bit messy is, I think, excusable.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here's a question. We may need a little help from the person who asked it, but I'll put my interpretation on it. So you talked about the importance of open source code for for scientific software. What about the use of proprietary tools like CUDA in the development of that code? And if I haven't got that right, maybe the person who wrote the question can chime in quickly.
I agree that this is a problem in the sense that it's a potential source of issues of reproducibility, especially as more stuff gets shifted into firmware that's also proprietary. Right? You can have some variance in, you're writing CUDA code that's going to go and run on the NVIDIA's GPU. You might get slightly different results in terms of the rounding that's done that is part of decision making that takes place that isn't necessarily entirely in user control. There's sort of sources of variance there that are difficult to account for. So if your goal is sort of like complete computational reproducibility and transparency around that process, this is an impediment to that. It's a practical reality that we have to deal with the fact that CUDA code exists and it runs on the best hardware for doing many tasks, but I consider it a bit of a problem, right? From a sort of philosophical perspective, it's we're tainting our scientific epistemology with just a hint of alchemy whenever we're using something that has that at its bottom.
Yeah. Although I'll just add here, there's some things are easier to deal with than others. So we have more control over our own code. We may not be able to avoid using CUDA depending on the platforms we're targeting or other proprietary tools, but we presumably can make our own code at least open if we choose.
Indeed, yeah. So it's of the as open as possible, as closed as necessary maxim applies.
Right.
Yeah.
So next question. Under documentation of theory and assumptions is not explicitly mentioned. Is this an intentional omission?
No, perhaps
go ahead.
No, perhaps I haven't spelled that out adequately in my description of what should be in documentation. I think it's in some cases reasonable to sort of outsource that slightly, in that you can say, I'm going to refer you to the manuscript for some of that detail, but I should at least provide a high-level summary of it in the documentation so that people have a big picture view when they encounter a repository of what it's intended to do.
All right. What are the best practices for sharing a code and specifying credit giving your work on a What are best practices for sharing a code and specifying credit giving for your work on a code repository, not shared by the original author, but if you've only improved it and not solely written it?
Well, so it may depend a little bit on the specific circumstances, but say if you're let's say you've taken code from an original author's repository that is openly licensed. Maybe you've forked it and made your own variant on it. You should provide adequate attribution of the original work. If you're updating the citation information, you can use some of the contributor roles taxonomies potentially to indicate that. So there's like a standardized set of terms that you can use to annotate your contributions, and some of them have different tiers. So you can say, modified or edited from the original work in a sort of standardized form that can be read by something that is looking for those particular tools. So it's still, I think, an evolving area of practice. So it's a little bit unclear precisely what best practices are, but I think the guiding principle of it is be accurate in your description of what work is yours, what work is the original author's, and what you added. When you can reflect that in some nice succinct metadata with the available tools, try to do so.
Yeah, I'll just add, Richard's slides mentioned things like the credit taxonomy, which have some ways of differentiating different types of contributions. There's also more in the repository contributor sense, there's things like all contrib or all contributors, I don't remember the exact name of the tool, that has a lot of, it's trying to help give credit for people who contribute to a repository, and it has a lot of different ways that people might contribute that are part of its own, setup configuration. So that might be a source of ideas about different roles and how to think about them as well.
Excellent suggestion, David. Yeah, I don't think I mentioned that, and I should, but all contributors is worth adding to my notes.
Just two more questions. So one is simple and short, but maybe complex in the long run. Is everything we post to GitHub automatically licensed?
No. So everything you post to GitHub has some terminal. I forget precisely what the contours of GitHub's user agreement are, but you agree to allow other people to fork your projects and have them on the GitHub platform, if I remember what's in GitHub's click wrap agreement. But that's sort of between you and GitHub specifically, but it doesn't apply a particular license to the code that you produce. So it by default in pretty much all legal regimes, because everyone's signed up to the same international copyright treaties, you retain the copyright to your work, and anyone who wants to reuse it would need to get your permission to do so and come to a licensing agreement with you if they want to do so without incurring the risk that you could sue them, or that whomever it is who owns the intellectual property rights, which might be your organization, could sue them. So you want to make sure that the liability is disclaimed for anyone reusing your work, and that's why you want to include a license file and follow the rules of that specific license for how it should be distributed. Like a lot of licenses will require that if you send someone the software, you should include a copy of the license with that software. So just adding it to the Git repository is the convention, everyone should do that when you post a code publicly, if you want other people to be able to reuse it without concern, and, for example, include it in a computational pipeline or something like that. I mean, there's some limits around free use, so fair use or fair dealing, depending on which side of your Atlantic you're on. Fair dealing is our version of fair use, but that's you don't want to have to be arguing for fair use exceptions, because that will ultimately end up involving lawyers. You don't want to do that. It's expensive.
Yeah, let me amplify that just a little bit. So the default, when you put something out there, code or a written document or anything else, when you share it publicly, well, actually, whether you share it or not, it's considered copyright on creation. You own the copyright, or maybe your employer owns the copyright. And so if you put it out there without adding a license to it, the default is essentially all rights reserved, which is probably text that people are, have seen but never really thought about. And it's exactly what Richard said, right? Nobody else can actually do anything with it legally without negotiating a license, without negotiating the rights to do that. So that's why it's so important. So it's not, some people have the idea that putting something out there on a place like GitHub without a license file means that it's in the public domain, but it's exactly the opposite of that. And so this is why actively thinking about and expressing the license you want to apply is so very important to code that you put out there.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that the concept of the public domain doesn't actually exist in all jurisdictions. So it's a thing that's there in the US, but you can't give up your or sign away your rights quite as easily to ownership of content in some countries in Europe, in particular Germany. So there are modified versions of these licenses that are internationalized to achieve something as analogous as possible to the public domain with their language. As exists in some of these other jurisdictions. So
like CC0, Creative Commons 0.
Yeah, the earliest versions of CC0 don't have the internationalized bit. So if you do like the CC0 4.0 international or whatever, that's the one that is currently most broad in terms of the number of jurisdictions whose weird exemptions it's managed to cover.
Right. And one last question. What about simulations that require large amounts of resources that might not be available to reviewers to rerun?
Yes, this is one of the interesting, challenging cases, right? How do you handle that? There is not really a straightforward answer, other than some of the things that you can do to sort of mitigate it and attempt to demonstrate that the simulation could be rerun is using a testing scale version of it, something that can produce a more limited size of data and still produce sort of the technically correct outputs, even if it's not large enough to speak to the question that you want to investigate. That's one approach. So, using a smaller set, but yeah, I think that's still kind of unsettled. It's tricky to address.
All right, those are all the questions that people have submitted, and we've had a bunch of people sticking around, so thank you all very much, and a special thanks to Richard for an excellent webinar. As I mentioned, we'll get the recordings and the Q&A and stuff posted as soon as we can, hopefully within about a week. I'll also mention that probably the next webinar won't be until August. A couple of things have come up with the June and July timeframes that, so I don't think we'll have them then. So look forward to seeing you back in a couple of months and hope everybody has a good time off.
Thanks
all.
very much.